The maid didn't ask why the boy was bleeding. She asked why he was apologizing. Jesse Cohen was 5 years old, and he had already learned how to be quiet in pain. In the Cohen house on Selby Lane in Atherton, silence was mistaken for strength, order was mistaken for care, and a well-behaved child was considered a healthy one. So when Jesse scraped his right cheek earlier that afternoon, he didn't run. He didn't cry. He didn't call for help. He sat still. He pressed a tissue to his face. And when the new maid knelt in front of him, all he said was, "I'm sorry. Not for the blood, not for the pain, but for being seen." What Jesse didn't know was that someone else had just walked into the house, and what that man was about to witness would quietly undo everything he believed he had done right as a father. Before we continue, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's dive back into the story. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of 91 Selby Lane, casting geometric shadows across the marble floors. Everything in the Cohen household moved like clockwork, silent, efficient, polished. No chaos, no raised voices, just the soft clink of silverware against fine china and the rustle of the Wall Street Journal. Jesse sat at the breakfast table, his posture unnaturally straight for a boy his age. A faint mark bloomed on his right cheek, pink and tender, shaped like fingers. He stared at his untouched omelet, fork hovering above the plate as if waiting for permission. Frederick Cohen sat across from him, his eyes never leaving the financial reports spread before him. His suit was pressed to razor-sharp creases, his coffee cooling in a cup he hadn't touched. "Eat before it gets cold," he said without looking up. His voice carried no warmth, no concern, just instruction. Jesse reached for his fork. The chair scraped against the floor, barely a whisper of sound. He flinched. "I'm sorry," he blurted out, his voice small and automatic. Caitlin, standing near the kitchen doorway with fresh towels in her arms, paused. Her eyes moved from Jesse to Frederick, then back to the boy. The apology hung in the air, disproportionate to the sound that prompted it. A chair scraping shouldn't summon fear. A minor noise shouldn't require penance. She stepped closer, her voice gentle as morning light. "You didn't do anything wrong." Jesse's shoulders remained tense. "I know," he said immediately, too immediately. The response was rehearsed, muscle memory disguised as understanding. Some homes don't raise their voices. They raise children to lower theirs. Caitlin folded the towel slowly, her trained eyes taking inventory of what others refused to see. That's when she noticed it. A thin line of dried blood near Jesse's right ear, dark against his pale skin. Fresh enough to be from last night, old enough that no one had bothered to clean it. Frederick turned a page of his newspaper. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel. Jesse ate his breakfast in perfect silence, each bite measured and controlled. He'd learned the first rule of 91 Selby Lane: take up as little space as possible, make as little sound as necessary, and apologize for existing before anyone asks you to. Caitlin's stomach turned. The blood no one had acknowledged. The apology no one had questioned. The silence everyone had mastered. Most people don't notice the moment a child learns to disappear. Stay means you will. The afternoon light painted gold across the Persian rug in the living room, where Jesse played with a small wooden train set, the only toy visible in the entire house. He moved the pieces carefully, silently, as though even his imagination needed to whisper. His foot caught the edge of the coffee table as he reached for a fallen train car. He stumbled, his knee hitting the floor with a muted thud. The impact wasn't hard, but it was enough. Jesse froze. Not the natural pause of assessing injury. This was different. His entire body locked mid-motion, like a rabbit sensing a predator. His hand moved to his cheek, touching the faint mark there. He winced, his face contorting for half a second before something clicked behind his eyes. The pain was pushed down, buried beneath layers of practiced control. His expression smoothed, his breathing steadied. He forced stillness into his small frame with the precision of someone twice his age. Caitlin had been dusting the bookshelf across the room, but her hands had stopped moving the moment Jesse fell. She watched the transformation happen in real time, The suppression, the self-correction, the erasure of discomfort. She set down her cloth and crossed the room, kneeling to eye level. Before she could open her mouth, before she could offer comfort or check for injury, Jesse spoke. "I'm okay." His voice was flat, automatic. "I don't cry." The words hit her like cold water. Not "I'm not hurt." Not "I'm fine." But a declaration of what he would not allow himself to do. "Who told you that?" Caitlin asked softly, searching his face. Jesse shrugged, his eyes dropping to the train still clutched in his hand. "It's just how it is." No memory attached to the rule. No specific moment he could name. Just an invisible law that had seeped into his bones through repetition, through silence, through watching what happened when rules were broken. Children rarely remember the lesson, only the rule. Caitlin's chest tightened as understanding settled over her like a heavy blanket. Jesse wasn't afraid of the pain itself, the scraped knee, the bruised cheek, the small hurts of childhood. He was afraid of being seen hurting, afraid of what his pain might cost him in a house where emotions were treated like inconveniences to be managed and erased. He'd learned that suffering in silence was safer than seeking comfort. Most people don't see the difference between a child who doesn't cry and a child who's been taught not to. Stay, and you'll learn to tell them apart. The previous caregiver's words still echoed in the hallways of 91, Selby Lane, though Bridget Hale had been gone for months. She'd lasted 18 months in the Cohen household, longer than most. Professional, efficient, and firm in her philosophy of child-rearing. "He cries too easily," she told Frederick one evening after Jesse had tears in his eyes over a scraped elbow. "It's not good for him. Boys need to learn resilience." Frederick had nodded, agreement settling easily into his worldview. Elena had been absent that week, a medical conference in Geneva. The nanny's words made sense to a man who'd built an empire on emotional control and strategic thinking. "He'll toughen up," Bridget had assured him with confidence. "It's what they need at this age." None of it felt cruel at the time. Frederick remembered the night Jesse had nightmares about monsters under the bed. He'd gone to his son's room, sat on the edge of the mattress, and placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're strong," he'd said with conviction, believing he was building character. "Be strong." Jesse had looked up at him with wide eyes, desperate for comfort his father mistook for weakness. "You're fine," Frederick had said, standing. The words weren't harsh, they were matter-of-fact, delivered with the same tone he used to discuss quarterly projections. Jesse had nodded, silent, and turned to face the wall. Frederick had closed the door, feeling like a good father, like a man teaching his son important lessons about the world, about strength, about not letting emotions control you. Bridget had reinforced it. "Consistency is key," she'd reminded him. "Don't coddle. Don't cave to tears. They learn fast." And Jesse did learn fast. He learned that his feelings were problems to be solved through suppression. He learned that crying made adults uncomfortable, disappointed, distant. He learned that strong meant silent, that fine was the only acceptable answer, and that love came with conditions he couldn't always see but always felt. Intent does not erase impact. The adults in Jesse's life hadn't gathered in dark rooms plotting his emotional destruction. They'd made breakfast, enforced bedtimes, and told themselves they were preparing him for a difficult world. They'd confused hardness with strength, silence with maturity, compliance with wellness. No villain had entered 91, Selby Lane. Just well-meaning people who'd never questioned whether their good intentions were building resilience or breaking trust. If no one meant harm, why does the child feel unsafe? Why does he flinch at sounds that shouldn't frighten? Why does he apologize for existing? Most people believe good intentions are enough. Stay, and you'll see why they're not. The bathroom on the second floor became Jesse's refuge, the only room in 91, Selby Lane with a lock he could control. He'd bumped his face against the edge of his bedroom door while reaching for a book on the high shelf. The same cheek. The tender mark from before had barely begun to fade. Blood ran from the reopened wound, a thin red line trailing down toward his jaw. Jesse's hands shook as he grabbed tissue from the marble countertop, pressing it against his skin with trembling fingers. The white paper bloomed crimson. He stared at his reflection in the gilt-framed mirror, a small boy with wet eyes he refused to let overflow. His breathing came fast and shallow, panic rising in his chest like floodwater. But crying would mean failure. Crying would mean disappointing everyone who'd ever told him to be strong. "Don't cry," he whispered to himself, voice cracking. "Don't cry. Don't cry. Don't cry." The words became a mantra, a desperate prayer to a god of self-control he'd been taught to worship. His free hand gripped the edge of the sink until his knuckles went white. The tissue in his other hand grew heavier with blood. Outside the door, Caitlin paused in the hallway. She'd been collecting laundry from Jesse's room when she heard the bathroom door lock. That alone wasn't unusual, but the sink had been running for 3 minutes straight. Too long for washing hands, too constant for any normal use. She approached the door, pressing her ear close. She could hear it now, the shallow, stuttered breathing of someone trying not to cry, the sound of a child teaching himself to suffer in silence. "Jesse," her voice was gentle, careful not to startle. "Can I come in?" Silence. Then the water shut off abruptly. "I'm okay." His voice was barely audible, thin as spider silk. The automatic response, delivered even through pain. Caitlin's heart clenched. She could picture him on the other side of that door, small, hurting, convinced that asking for help was worse than bleeding alone. This was the culmination of every "be strong and you're fine" he'd ever heard. This was what happened when a child learned that vulnerability was something to hide. What Frederick believed kept his son safe was teaching him to bleed alone. The lock clicked. The bathroom door opened. Jesse stood there, tissue pressed to his cheek, eyes red-rimmed but dry. He'd won his battle against tears. He'd followed the rule. And somehow, his small victory looked like the saddest defeat Caitlin had ever witnessed. Most people think privacy means safety. Stay, and you'll learn the difference. Caitlin lifted Jesse onto the marble counter with gentle hands, positioning him near the sink where the light was best. His legs dangled, small sneakers barely reaching the cabinet doors below. Blood still traced a line down his right cheek. The tissue he'd been clutching now crumpled and discarded in the waste bin. "Let me see," she said softly, reaching for the first aid kit beneath the sink. Jesse sat perfectly still, that practiced stillness he'd mastered. But his eyes tracked her movements with something new, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this adult was different. Caitlin dampened a clean cloth with warm water and began cleaning the wound with care that felt foreign in this house. Each touch was deliberate, gentle, asking permission without words. "You don't have to be brave here," she whispered, her voice carrying a truth Jesse had never been offered before. His breath hitched. His carefully constructed walls trembled. "I didn't want Daddy to be upset." His voice broke on the last word, and with it, something fundamental shattered. The tears he'd fought so hard to contain spilled over, running down his cheeks alongside the blood Caitlin was cleaning away. But this time, he didn't apologize for them. This time he smiled, a small, trembling smile of relief. Relief that someone had seen him hurting and hadn't looked away. Relief that his tears didn't make her disappointed or distant. Relief that for one moment in his carefully controlled life, he was allowed to be a child who needed comfort. Caitlin's own eyes glistened as she continued her work, one hand steadying his face, while the other cleaned the wound with infinite patience. Neither of them noticed Frederick in the doorway. He stood frozen, his hand still on the doorframe, his expression unreadable. He'd come upstairs to check on running water, expecting to find a plumbing issue or a forgotten faucet. Instead, he found this: his son crying in the arms of the maid, wearing a smile Frederick hadn't seen in months. The tableau was perfect in its painful clarity. Jesse, sitting on the counter, blood on his right cheek being tenderly wiped away. Caitlin's gentle hands offering comfort his own never had. His son's tears, once forbidden, now falling freely, mixed with something that looked dangerously close to happiness. Sometimes love arrives quietly and undoes everything we believed. The moment felt complete, like truth had finally surfaced after months submerged, like healing had begun, like the worst was behind them. But Frederick still hadn't said a word. His silence filled the doorway like a physical presence, and Caitlin's hands stilled as she felt his gaze on them. Most people think witnessing the truth is the same as accepting it. Stay, and you'll see what happens when a father must choose between his beliefs and his son. Frederick remained in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, watching Caitlin apply a small bandage to Jesse's cheek with practiced care. The silence stretched thin until finally he found his voice, though it came out quieter than he'd ever heard it. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Jesse's eyes shifted from Caitlin to his father, tears still wet on his face. For a moment, he looked like he might retreat back into the safety of "I'm okay," back into the patterns that had kept him safe. But something had broken open in that bathroom, and truth spilled out before he could stop it. "You look busy." 3 words, delivered without accusation, without anger, just simple observation from a child who'd learned to read the room better than any 7-year-old should. Frederick felt them land like physical blows, each syllable small detonation in his chest. Not "I was scared." Not "I didn't think you'd care." Just "You look busy." Frederick's mind raced backward through countless evenings, board meetings that ran late, phone calls he'd taken during dinner, the Wall Street Journal he'd read while Jesse ate breakfast in silence. He'd been there, physically present in the same house, the same room, sometimes the same space, but busy, always looking at something more important than the small boy who'd learned not to interrupt. "I thought I was doing enough," Frederick said, his voice barely above a whisper. The confession escaped before he could contain it, professional armor cracking to reveal the man beneath, uncertain, afraid, wrong. Caitlin met his eyes across the bathroom, Jessie still seated on the counter between them. Her voice was gentle but unflinching. "Enough isn't the same as present." The words settled into the marble and mirrors, into the expensive fixtures and designer tile. This bathroom, like everything else in 91 Selby Lane, was perfect, provided for, enough, and completely insufficient. Provision without presence leaves children rich and alone. Frederick looked at his son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in months. The bandage on his cheek, the tear-stained face, the small smile that had appeared for someone else's gentleness. Jesse had everything a child could need. The best schools, the finest clothes, a house worth millions, a trust fund that would secure his future. But he'd been teaching himself to stop bleeding in locked bathrooms because his father looked busy. Frederick understood this truth could not be undone, only carried. The damage wasn't something he could fix with money, or influence, or strategic planning. It lived in the space between them now, acknowledged, irreversible, demanding something he'd never learned to give. His son needed him, not his provision, not his plan for the future, just him. Most people think realizing the problem is the hardest part. Stay, and you'll see what happens when a man must become someone he's never been. The mornings at 91 Selby Lane began to shift in ways that couldn't be measured by clocks or calendars. Frederick started waking 20 minutes earlier, not for emails or market reports, but to sit at the breakfast table before Jesse came down. He folded the Wall Street Journal and left it on the counter, unread. When Jesse entered the dining room that first morning, he paused, confused by the deviation from routine. His father sat at the table, coffee untouched, hands folded, waiting. "Good morning," Frederick said, and for the first time in months, he looked directly at his son when he spoke. Jesse hesitated, then climbed into his chair. "Good morning." The silence that followed wasn't the usual efficient quiet of a household running on autopilot. It was different, uncomfortable in its newness, but softer somehow. Frederick watched Jesse reach for his fork, watched him glance up nervously, watched him prepare to navigate another landmine morning. "How did you sleep?" Frederick asked. Such a simple question, such an ordinary thing to ask a child. But Jesse blinked as if he'd been addressed in a foreign language. "Okay," he said automatically, then paused. Something in his father's expression, open, waiting, genuinely asking, made him add, "I had a bad dream." Frederick didn't tell him he was fine, didn't tell him to be strong. He simply nodded. Do you want to talk about it? These conversations didn't fix everything overnight. Frederick still struggled with the instinct to solve rather than listen, to instruct rather than comfort. But he showed up. He sat at eye level when Jesse spoke. He learned to recognize when "I'm okay" meant the opposite. He started asking, "Does that hurt?" instead of assuming. "What do you need?" instead of deciding. "Can you tell me what happened?" instead of moving on. Caitlin watched these changes from her position in the household. Still the maid, still folding towels and preparing meals, still moving through rooms with quiet efficiency. There was no promotion, no public acknowledgement of what she'd done. Frederick didn't gather the staff to praise her insight. She didn't become family or confidant. She remained what she'd always been, a steady presence in a house learning to see its own wounds. One evening, as Caitlin cleaned the kitchen after dinner, Frederick appeared in the doorway. Jesse had gone upstairs to bed, a process that now included Frederick reading him a story, something that had never happened before. "Thank you," Frederick said, his voice carrying the weight of everything unsaid, "for seeing what I missed." Caitlin paused, dish towel in hand, and met his eyes. She didn't smile triumphantly or accept the gratitude as validation. She simply said, "Just keep looking." Healing begins when authority learns to listen. The house didn't transform into something unrecognizable. There were still hard mornings and old patterns that surfaced unexpectedly. Jesse still flinched sometimes. Frederick still had to consciously choose presence over productivity. But something fundamental had shifted in the foundation of 91 Selby Lane. The adults had stopped believing that silence meant strength. And slowly, carefully, Jesse was learning that his voice mattered, not because someone had rescued him, but because the people responsible had finally started paying attention. Most people want dramatic redemption. Stay, and you'll see why quiet transformation matters more. The story of 91 Selby Lane reveals a painful truth. Well-meaning adults can create unsafe spaces through emotional absence. A child doesn't stop crying because they are strong. They stop crying because they've learned that no one is coming. Frederick gave his son everything except presence. Good intentions don't erase impact. Provision without attention leaves children abandoned in houses full of everything except what they need most. The greatest harm is often done by those who never meant to hurt anyone at all. Change begins when authority learns to listen, when we see our impact, not just our intent. If this story made you think differently about the children in your life, consider sharing it. Someone in your circle might need to hear this. Drop a comment about what stood out to you. Your perspective matters. And if you want more stories that make us pause and reflect, subscribe so you don't miss them. Most people will scroll past and forget, but some will recognize a child they know. For them, stay awake.